my absolute pleasure to kick off Talking Point today. I'm Shalini Aranagiri, the Deputy Clinical Director here at Turning Point, and really excited to kick off this session today focusing on methamphetamine use and specifically on the N-acetylcysteine trial of the NICE trial, and welcoming the Chief Investigator from that trial, Rebecca McKinnon, to join us. Before we get started, just some housekeeping issues. I think everyone's really well Zoom trained. I can see everyone's turned their video off and their mute on. So if you just want to stay on mute during the session, right at the end, we'll take some questions from the audience, and we'll also, if you've got questions, pop them in through the chat, and we'll save some time at the end for that. Just wanting to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet across Australia today. So here in Richmond, in Melbourne, just wanting to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose lands we meet, but also the traditional owners and the respect to elders emerging and past and present across Australia. Wanting to introduce now, without further ado, Rebecca McKinnon, who is joining us here in Sydney. Associate Professor Rebecca McKinnon leads a program of research into stimulant use epidemiology and interventions at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, NDAC, in UNSW. The current research involves the online breakthrough of psychological help for people who use stimulants, such as breaking the ice, and the trial of new pharmacotherapy options for meth dependence, including the N-acetylcysteine trial, which we're talking about today, the Lima trial, and also future trials. You've got Rebecca's bio, I think, in the introduction today, so I'm going to throw over to Rebecca to get us started.
Thank you. Let's hope that I can do this competently. Can you hear me okay? And then I'll do the maximize thing. As Shalini has explained, today I'll be talking about the N-acetylcysteine trial, or NICE, where we were using N-acetylcysteine as potential pharmacotherapy for methamphetamine dependence. What we did was a 12-week trial where we gave people 2.4 grams a day of either N-acetylcysteine or placebo for meth dependence. For those of you who are not familiar with N-acetylcysteine, at the time we were starting out this process, was one of the forerunners as a potential candidate pharmacotherapy for methamphetamine use, and also being used for other drugs. It's different than a lot of the approaches we've used in pharmacotherapy to date, in that it's targeting the glutamate system, and the aim is to restore balance to that system, which is disrupted in addiction. And N-acetylcysteine was found to reduce craving for a variety of different drugs. So it's not a drug-specific compound, and that had also been found to be the case for methamphetamine use in humans. But the big question mark was whether these reductions that had been seen in quite experimental settings, reductions in craving for meth use that had been seen in experimental settings, whether they could translate into a meaningful reduction in methamphetamine use amongst people who are actively using the drug. I mean, we're particularly keen to try this drug because it doesn't have any dependence liability in and of itself. It's a take-home medication. It's also used as a vitamin supplement. It's used to treat chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's used to manage paracetamol overdose. So it's actually got other applications in medicine. We know a lot about it. We know a lot about its safety profile. So it was quite exciting because if this had worked, I've kind of given away the punchline there, but if this had worked, we could actually have a medication that we could give to people that they could take home very conveniently, very safe, to help them reduce their cravings and improve or help them to reduce their methamphetamine use as well. Our primary hypothesis was to see whether or not if people took this medication, it could help them reduce their methamphetamine use. So our primary outcomes are days of methamphetamine use. We also looked at positive oral fluid samples, which we took weekly. Our secondary outcomes were craving for methamphetamine, because it had been found to reduce craving in previous studies, severity of dependence, withdrawal symptoms, and psychiatric symptoms. And we're interested in the psychiatric symptoms because N-acetylcysteine has been used in neuropsychiatry to manage symptoms in people with mania and schizophrenia and other neuropsychiatric symptoms. It has a dual action, so not only does it help restore balance to glutamate function, but it also is a very potent antioxidant, and it reduces oxidative stress in the brain. If you know anything about meth neurotoxicity, you know that oxidative stress is quite a critical process in methamphetamine toxicity. And in fact, in experimental studies, if you use N-acetylcysteine, it protects against meth neurotoxicity. Anyway, so because of that, we were hoping, that the N-acetylcysteine might also settle some of the psychiatric symptoms that we see, some of which we think are related to the neurotoxicity. So what did we do? We screened a lot of people, and Ramesh will tell you a bit more about that later. We weren't able to take everyone on board the trial. A lot of these people, most people were eligible, so we didn't have really tight criteria for eligibility in that, we weren't excluding lots of people. Most people who weren't eligible were not eligible because they're already in treatment or because they weren't using heavily enough. But we actually lost a lot of people because we weren't able to get them onto the trial fast enough. So the phones would run hot for a few days after we'd advertised. So we randomized 153 people, and half to NAC or N-acetylcysteine and half to placebo. They both got 12 weeks of medication, which they took daily, either NAC or placebo. It's double-blind controlled trial. Similar to most other methamphetamine trials that have been done, the compliance was suboptimal. So a lot of people just didn't take the medication as intended. And so it makes it very hard to pick up signals. That's something to keep in mind. For our main outcome data on days of use, we have really good follow-up rates, and that's because we use timeline follow-back. So even if people missed one assessment, we're able to fill in the data at the next weekly assessment. So that we're really happy with that. The oral fluid test relied on face-to-face assessments, and that was much harder, and we lost a lot more data there. So we overall had about 60%, 60-something% follow-up for the oral fluid samples. It's a bit more missing data. In the analyses, we did sensitivity analyses where we imputed the missing data. It didn't really make any difference to the results, just to let you know. The people who got the placebo and the people who got NAC looked really similar. And Ramesh will talk more about the characteristics of the sample later, so I won't steal his thunder. But there are very subtle differences in unemployment and income. One interesting thing I will mention is that the majority of them were smoking methamphetamine, and only around half of them had a history of having been to treatment. So it's a little bit different than the type of sample that you might see going into, say, residential rehab or detoxification. I think from here on, you see the graphs. That's probably the most important bit. These are the outcomes from the study. So the bars represent the median days of use in the past 4 weeks. And you can see when people came into the study at baseline. So this is basically the assessment at which they got their medication for the first time. And then we said at this one, it's assessment in the past 28 days, how many days have you used methamphetamine? And you'll see the median number of days is like 24, 25 days of methamphetamine use out of 28. So it's quite heavy use. For most people, it's daily or almost daily use when they started the study. And there's no difference between the placebo group and the N-acetylcysteine group, which is in white here. Placebo group's dark. When we look at the outcomes at 4 weeks, so again in the past 28 days, what you can see here is that they're using less often. But it's the same for both the N-acetylcysteine group and the placebo group. So both groups reduce their use quite significantly at 4 weeks compared to their baseline use. But N-acetylcysteine did not improve outcomes over and above the placebo medication. And we saw very much the same thing at 8 weeks and again at 12 weeks. So very similar outcomes, regardless of whether someone took N-acetylcysteine or whether they took placebo. When we look at the oral fluid test, we can see here a very similar result. On the y-axis, you see the proportion who have positive oral fluid tests for methamphetamine use, and it's up around 70–80%. So most of them are still using methamphetamine through the trial to some extent, even if they've reduced the number of days that they've used. And you'll see here very little difference between your placebo group with the dark black squares and the open circles in N-acetylcysteine. So when we put this into our magical statistical model, it confirmed what you can see very clearly on the graph, that there was no significant effect of N-acetylcysteine on either methamphetamine use days or on whether or not someone returned an oral fluid sample that was positive for methamphetamine. We saw quite matching results for craving. What you see here is a reduction in craving from the baseline to week 1, which would match with a reduced frequency of methamphetamine use during the trial period. However, there's no difference between the N-acetylcysteine and the placebo. So we were expecting to get an effect on craving, and we didn't see that effect. Severity of dependence, very much the same outcome. Reduced severity of dependence during the 12-week trial period, but that was true for both placebo and N-acetylcysteine. Withdrawal, there's no difference between the groups either. When we look at the psychiatric symptoms, we have a lot more noise in the data, and it's a little bit harder. It was a little bit harder for us to pick up what was going on here. But overall, we didn't see any difference between N-acetylcysteine and placebo on positive psychotic symptoms. So that's hallucinating, feeling paranoid, having unusual delusional thoughts. We didn't see any significant difference on depression. We didn't see any significant difference on suicidality, even though you might look at this and be hopeful that there is a significant difference here. There's enough noise in this data that this wasn't a significant benefit of NAC over placebo. And the same for hostility. We were very excited about this because you can see this p-value here is normally if you use a p-value of 0.05, you go, yes, we got a significant finding. But in our study protocol, we designated a p-value of 0.01 to control for the fact that we had several different secondary outcome measures. And consequently, we actually claim this is a null effect, even though you can see difference between the groups and it does appear to be something going on. We looked at adverse events as well. N-acetylcysteine is known to cause gastrointestinal upset, so reflux, diarrhea, and nausea. We didn't see any difference between the groups in terms of the proportion of people reporting gastrointestinal upset, although both groups are quite high. These are the most common other symptoms that people had. Please understand that these are not necessarily related to the medication. We just measure everything that's happening to everyone throughout the study. So if someone had a cold, it would be recorded under respiratory. If they fell off their motorbike, it would get recorded here. Or if they had an overdose, it would get recorded here. They're not necessarily related to N-acetylcysteine, but what we could see is that there's no difference between groups. So it's actually good. It means that the N-acetylcysteine group didn't experience more side effects or problems, health problems, than the placebo group. So it's well tolerated, just didn't work, unfortunately. We found the same thing on global satisfaction. I guess it kind of makes sense that if there's no difference in outcomes between groups, that you probably see no difference in ratings of effectiveness or satisfaction on the medication. And that's what we found here. There's basically no difference in whether people thought it was more or less convenient. Taking the same number of doses every day. And this appears that there's a few more side effects in the N-acetylcysteine group, which is what you honestly expect, but wasn't a significant difference. And as I showed you on the previous slide, there weren't any differences in specific symptoms between groups. So in conclusion, it didn't work. So N-acetylcysteine at 2,400 milligrams per day did not reduce methamphetamine use compared to placebo, nor did it reduce craving, as it's been seen to do in other studies, severity of dependence, withdrawal, or psychiatric symptoms. They found some evidence that it might potentially reduce hostility, but it's a bit controversial. It might be a chance finding. We aren't really sure what to make of that. So that's the bad news. But I just wanted to acknowledge all of the people who put a tremendous amount of effort into this study. If you're interested in the findings, we've just published the paper, and once we've got the proofs, we'll be putting it onto our website. And this is our website here, so you can find out more about the trial there. These are some of the faces of people who are involved in the study. And I can see Shalini, you're missing, but you can see Ramez there. Shalini was supervising the medical side of things down at Turning Point, and she did a fantastic job. Just wanted to acknowledge her contribution to the study, and not to mention Ramez, who he's going to show you a little bit more about what he did, but it's fantastic work. Thanks, guys.
I'll just throw it to Ramez at this point, and then we'll take questions at the end. Just encourage everyone to pop your questions in the chat box as well. But might throw over to you, Ramez, if you're happy to go.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name's Ramez. I'm a research officer and PhD candidate here at Turning Point and Monash University. I've worked on a large number of studies and trials while I've been here at Turning Point in the last 6 or 7 years, and I found this trial to be particularly rewarding, and we got a lot of good feedback from the participants as well, who found their involvement in the trial really positive. And even though, the trial had negative findings in the sense that we didn't show the medication to be any more effective than the placebo, there are actually a range of positive outcomes for trial participants and some learnings, I think, that comes from this that we wanted to share with you. So today, I just wanted to reflect on this process of data collection, report some of these anecdotal experiences, and consider in more detail some of these positive outcomes that weren't that well reflected in the formal trial findings. Just to begin, I'll give you a bit of an overview on just the recruitment and data collection. We began recruitment in mid-2018 and completed data collection in March 2020. We had a lot of interest in the study. Just over 630 people got in touch here at the Melbourne site. About 1/5 of them were concerned parents. We referred about 30% of people who are interested to Direct Line. As Rebecca mentioned, we were seeking to recruit people who were non-treatment seekers. So people that were seeking treatment, we referred straight to Direct Line into the treatment system in Victoria. We assessed 183 people here in Melbourne for entry into the trial and recruited 52 of them. We had a pretty decent follow-up rate if you count phone assessments. Melbourne's a pretty large geographical area, so we weren't always able to meet people face-to-face, but we did about 75% of all the assessments that were scheduled. And just to reflect on this recruitment and data collection that we had here in Melbourne. So unlike most of the other studies I've worked on at Turning Point, we were looking for a non-treatment seeking cohort. And so this meant we couldn't recruit through treatment services, and really we got some great media coverage at the start of the study that really drove a lot of our recruitment and interest in the study. The story, I think we just had one media release, and that got picked up nationally and internationally. Rebecca did some, I think, morning talk shows and radio interviews. And this drove interest in recruitment in the trial almost throughout the whole length of the trial. We also did some Facebook advertising that was really helpful as well. And it was interesting that people were so keen for NAC, even though it was an unproven treatment. I spent a lot of time explaining to people, many treatment naive people, that there were already a range of proven treatments that were free, that were available to them. And sometimes it took a bit of convincing. People said, okay, I need treatment, but I want to try this unproven medication. So that was interesting. And I think in reflecting on that, it seems like there is a bit of a poor awareness among some parts of the community about how to engage in alcohol and drug treatment. And I think perhaps we as a sector might need to do a bit of a better job of explaining to people the different options that are available and how to engage in treatment. And so in Victoria, perhaps maybe some more advertising around Direct Line. A lot of people have this opinion, I think, that rehab is the only option available, and perhaps we can do a better job also of just explaining some of the other community-based options that are out there. In terms of our data collection, it's a bit of an obvious point, but maintaining good rapport and regular contact with our participants, I think, was a key thing in ensuring that they came back to the weekly assessments that we did. We conducted weekly assessments for 3 months, and we got a pretty good, the 75% follow-up rate is pretty good for this kind of study. And for some people, this meant contacting them multiple times a week just to kind of make sure that they were going to attend. And that regular sort of engagement was really helpful. Reflecting a little about our actual cohort. So as I mentioned, it was a non-treatment seeking sample. And in a way, perhaps this is a little bit more representative of people in the community who use drugs than we might normally see in drug treatment, or at least more representative of a group that don't engage in treatment. We had a higher proportion of women than we often see in treatment seeking samples, a high diversity of socioeconomic backgrounds. About half the participants were employed. People, at least in Melbourne, were employed across a range of different kinds of jobs. We had high income earners, medium income earners, low income earners, unemployed people. And this is despite the fact that people typically reported using methamphetamine for a long time. I think the median length of use was 14 years across the study. And I think this is a reminder that the stigmatizing stereotype that's out there in the community around people who use methamphetamine is quite inaccurate and potentially harmful in that it prevents people from seeking treatment. I think another reflection around this is that in the alcohol and drug treatment sector, at least, we only really see one slice of the pie, which can skew our perspective potentially of people who use drugs. There's obviously a much greater diversity of people who use drugs in the community. For instance, we know that the majority of people who use illicit substances will never have significant problems. Most people who have problems, we know, go on to recover without treatment. And even though if they sought treatment, they may have recovered quicker, this does, I think, give us a bit of a skewed perspective, potentially. And something that stuck out to me about our cohort was that we might need to reconsider this notion of hard to reach cohorts, which I think potentially might be a bit of a problematic and stigmatizing idea to begin with. But this study for me highlighted that there were groups of people in the community whose needs were not being well met, particularly people who are employed and people who find the kind of regular face-to-face treatment options not suitable. We had a number of people at our site, at least, who reported feeling quite hemmed in with their work and life commitments and not having the time or space in their lives to really seek treatment during working hours or have the time to take time off work to seek treatment. And so I think potentially more could be done to address the needs of this group. Reflecting now on some of our positive outcomes, even though the medication wasn't shown to be effective, as Rebecca mentioned, we had a pretty substantial positive effect across the whole study. And so there was, I think the median reduction was around 7 days use, which equates to about a 30% reduction against the median baseline use. And I think that's quite a favourable comparison to other psychotherapies. And it's worth pausing, I think, a little just to reflect on why this might be the case. There's a few reasons that come to mind in reflecting on this. Firstly, that we have a highly motivated sample, and I think we can't really underestimate this readiness to change aspect. We were attracting into this study a group of people who are willing to take or try an unproven treatment. People were very keen in the way that they described their motivations to make a change in their lives. They were already using quite heavily. Yeah, they really had a high motivation to change. People reported that being engaged in this structured trial program was really useful. Just taking the medication twice a day was a constant reminder that they were in this process of change. People also reported that the weekly sessions were really useful. Reporting and reflecting back on their substance use across the week, people found quite useful. And I think anecdotally in research, this is something we often see, that people find the process of reflecting on and accounting for their substance use to be a useful thing. I think we also can't discount the placebo effect. while not a lot is known about the placebo effect in addiction settings, I think it's quite likely that it played quite a role here in this trial in driving this significant reduction in use. We know, for instance, that priming participants, that participant expectations and also researcher and clinician expectations can drive and moderate the placebo effect. And there's been quite a lot of research in this space, and we do know that placebos can have a large and potent impact on the effectiveness of medical and psychological interventions. And although research often seeks to minimize or control of placebo effects, I think placebos might have a significant clinical benefit and utility. They have been shown to have some quite strong effects for pain and to a lesser extent in mental health. And so just because they're a bit of an annoyance, maybe in the research setting doesn't mean it's something we can discount entirely in a clinical setting. Support. People did report that just having this regular contact with the researchers was really supportive. We obviously weren't delivering a formal intervention when we met with people, but people reported this support to be useful. And we know that social support is a well-established predictor of drug treatment. And I think also it's also been shown that social support and engagement with the researcher or clinician can moderate the placebo effect as well. So I think there was some interaction there. In finishing up, just a couple of final personal reflections. As I mentioned, I found this trial really rewarding. Research can at times feel a bit like an exploitative endeavour. You might only meet people once or twice, exchange some information, maybe reimburse them, but people don't always see a direct benefit from their involvement in a trial. And in this case, a large group of people with whom I interacted had significant and meaningful outcomes from the study. That was really rewarding. There was a group of people who swore that NAC worked for them. And this group were largely people who managed to maintain abstinence. Some of them were very keen to get NAC after the trial finished, because of course we couldn't continue to give them the medication. And while we don't really know whether this was a placebo effect or not, I think it's worth pointing out that our trial really wasn't designed to detect whether NAC would help people to maintain their abstinence. It was more looking at whether it would help people to reduce their substance use. And so the people who became abstinent were a much smaller group, and we weren't really able to detect that signal as strongly. So it's something potentially that there might be room to explore in the future. But of course, it could have just been a placebo effect. And just a final reflection to finish up, potentially a fairly obvious one. Substance use is a complex thing. People are often entangled in a network of complex social, psychological, economic, biological factors that make affecting change in their lives difficult and can take decades for some people to do this. Taking an effective medication in and of itself might only address a small part of that issue. And so this again kind of highlights the importance of some of these more, I guess, informal and formal social supports and other social and psychosocial interventions. And I think in reflecting on this and those who weren't finding the current treatment options suitable, I wonder the extent to which the treatment model that we have that's structured around short-term treatment doses is appropriate to support and meet the needs of those who might have really long-term and more complex problems versus, say, a treatment model that's built more around an integrated approach and ongoing long-term care and support. That's about it from me. Thanks for your time, and thanks so much to all the participants for their involvement and contributions and insights. Thanks, Rebecca, and the whole NICE team. I really enjoyed my opportunity to work on the trial and learnt a lot.
Thanks so much, Ramez. And I think we're hearing lots of feedback as well from the audience. I think they really appreciate your insights into the trial as well. And I think it's, such an interesting experience being able to be on that front line in recruitment. And I think, as Rebecca has explained as well, it's a multi-site trial. So this experience across all of the research teams, the capacity to come together with other researchers at the other sites as well and hear how everyone's going as well. Such a great opportunity. At this point, I might throw it open to the audience to keep putting questions in there. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of points that have been made so far, and if Ramez and Rebecca might be able to stick around to get the answers across. I think one of the things that was coming up, and I think for many people tuning in today, I think for us as well during the trial, I think really everyone's been kind of looking for, I suppose, a medication solution for meth use for a whole range of different reasons. But I think with this trial being a big multi-site trial that was really designed, as both Ramez and Rebecca have pointed out, to be able to detect if this medication specifically would help people reduce their meth use, and hasn't shown that's been effective. I was wondering, Rebecca, if you have any other comments on that? People are, saying, does this mean that it might work for other types of, stages of use? Could it work for people who are abstinent, as Ramez was pointing out? Obviously it's all speculative, but I think it's really helpful to kind of hear from the experts around this. Yeah, Rebecca, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Shalini. So one of the previous trials that had been conducted with people who use cocaine did find within their cohort that people who were abstinent at the start of the trial did better on NAC than if they're on placebo, which is supporting what Ramez is saying, that maybe once people are abstinent, that this drug can prevent relapse. And so there's definitely a possibility that that is the case. Our trial findings they can't confirm that that isn't the case, because everyone coming into this trial was already using the drug quite heavily, and most of them continued to use the drug throughout the trial. So our findings are more specific to using NAC in a context where people are actively engaged in heavy stimulant use. And they found the same thing with cocaine. I mean, when they tried it with that was cannabis actually, when they tried it with adolescents, who probably have less entrenched patterns of substance use, they got positive results. When they tried it with adults who were using it quite heavily, they didn't get very good results. In fact, they didn't get any benefit at all. So, and if you look at the theory behind NAC, there is a case to be made that it might not have the same benefit in people who are persisting with drug use. That, maybe you do need abstinence, and then it might be able to assist in reducing the cravings. But we can't confirm that based on our trial. I think we have to be clear that's still an unknown.
I guess drawing out that same point and the placebo effect that Ramez highlighted as well. I think I was wondering, Ramez, if you might be able to speak a little bit to the researcher roles in the trial as well, what that actually involved in terms of going out to people in the community, and what that kind of meant as well to people.
Sure. So yeah, we met with people weekly. That was either at the clinic here at Turning Point, and for most people, I ended up driving out to meet them at I guess a suitable but private location. That'd often be a fair bit of kind of informal touching base, hearing about how people's week went. There were a range of measures we delivered, some of which were pretty straightforward, kind of like screening tools, assessing people's dependence and their mental health. Some of them were fairly conversational and almost therapeutic. And yeah, I think it was this process of regularly touching base with people, checking in with them, and giving people this sort of opportunity to reflect on how things are progressing for them. That was really quite useful.
Well, I think that's really part of a unique factor too in a trial like this, because I think it was also, Rebecca highlighted it, designed to actually reach people rather than get people to come in to kind of specialist treatment centers. It was really kind of designed to meet people in the community, people who might not otherwise necessarily have kind of engaged with services. Certainly from doing some of the medical assessments, lots of people that we had in this trial were people who had never heard that was treatment necessarily for methamphetamine, might have seen an ad on social media or heard about it from a friend, and that's how they kind of engaged with the trial. And I think that raises a really interesting question, I guess, about just treatment more broadly, and I guess the capacity to sort of offer treatment for this group. I don't know if, Rebecca, you have anything to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, when we've done other surveys of people who use meth, we've asked them whether they've ever been to treatment, and if so, where they've been. And I think what we've found is very similar to what we found in this trial, and what Ramez has explained, that for a lot of people, they haven't been to treatment, or they're not aware of treatment services.
They don't know how to engage with the treatment service system. And their concept of what treatment is almost, it does align very closely with residential rehab, and that doesn't suit everyone. I'm not saying it doesn't suit some people, but it's more suited to the more marginalized group of participants that we might see. And I think one of the things we were able to do successfully with NICE is capture a broader spectrum of people who are using methamphetamine, including people who are employed, who had children, who had jobs, had life going on still. And I think it shows that there is a need for treatment options that are more accessible to that broader spectrum of people. What do you think, Ramez?
Yeah, very much so, Rebecca. I think, as you say, rehab's certainly an important option and an effective option. I mean, it's been shown to work, but people don't always have space in their lives to take 3 to 6 months off, a year off, to go and live somewhere else. And for people who have 9 to 5 or maybe 10-hour days, 5 or 6 days a week, it is hard for them to come into a treatment clinic sometimes. So yeah, I think there is certainly a case to be made to not only advertise treatment options more effectively, but also, maybe shift the way treatment is delivered to kind of reach this other group of people.
And I guess thinking about sort of medication treatments more broadly, because I guess this at the end of this trial, and now is opportunity for future trials in this space. What's the next thing on the horizon, Rebecca? What are the new treatments that are being investigated in this area?
Yeah, I mean, there are trials ongoing, and I think it's important to remember that we need, even when we don't get the results we want, it's still important to show that a particular medication doesn't work in a particular setting so that we can move on from that. One of the medications that has, it's actually a combination of medications that has produced positive results. It's a combination of bupropion. Actually, you're more familiar with it. Maybe you want to talk to it in a minute, but there are some positive trial results coming out of the US. We're actually about to trial methamphetamine. And that will be starting up next year. And there's been 2 positive trials in the USA that are not huge trials. One's 60 people, one's 120 people. And both of those have found positive effects on helping people to reduce the frequency of methamphetamine use. The effects are not huge, but they're significant in a clinical sense. And what we want to do is see whether we can replicate those outcomes, those positive outcomes, in frontline services in Australia. So watch out for that next year. Methamphetamine is an antidepressant drug, a generic antidepressant drug. So we'll also be looking at whether it reduces depression.
And I think the other drug that you mentioned, which has been trialed overseas, bupropion, is also sort of in that antidepressant drug family, and is also a medication that's used for smoking cessation. And so it's really interesting space where I suppose for medications that have been trialed in the past were largely sort of stimulant medications, and sort of the field has moved on from that clearly to look at other sort of mechanisms, including N-acetylcysteine, and now we're kind of looking at other antidepressant kind of mechanisms as well. Thinking too, I suppose, that might not necessarily be the antidepressant action itself, but there might be a whole range of different kind of mechanisms at play.
Yeah, so the bupropion one is interesting because they're combining it with Vivitrol, which is a long-acting naltrexone preparation. And so again, you've got more complex pharmacology underpinning that process, and they've got quite positive results with that. I suspect they're going to be moving forward with that in the US, and we won't get an opportunity to do it here for a little while, but it's still good to know that there are things on the horizon.
That's right. And I think what we're hearing overwhelmingly is that there's such a space for new treatments, as well as a space for offering more treatment for people from a whole range of different kind of backgrounds who may not necessarily be engaging in what's currently on offer. So I think it's such a great opportunity to kind of reflect on that fact, and the fact that we can actually offer existing treatments too more effectively across the spectrum. I think just kind of looking through some of the questions that have come up, there are a couple of questions around any other side effects, for instance, that we wanted to talk about or raise. Rebecca, did you have anything to add to that? This N-acetylcysteine specifically, I guess.
Sorry, do you mean side effects from other medications or N-acetylcysteine?
The questions are on N-acetylcysteine and side effects or adverse effects. And you had a slide on that earlier, I guess, pointing out gastrointestinal effects in particular, but not showing any difference between the groups.
Yeah, so we didn't see any difference between people who had the placebo and the N-acetylcysteine. The N-acetylcysteine is associated with gastrointestinal effects, rash, and there's a potential allergic reaction, which is quite rare, but that's often in a high dosage form than what we were using in this trial. Is that what you were interested in, or?
I think that's what the question is relating
Oh,
to.
sorry. Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry. Yeah. So, a minority of people experience gastrointestinal effects, but we didn't find any difference between groups. And most of the trials that have used these low doses in oral formulation haven't found that. But that's not to say it doesn't happen. It's just we're not getting a significant difference between the groups. I noticed there's one other question about p-values of 0.01. I just wanted to say with our hostility finding and why that wasn't significant. When you do multiple, or you have lots of outcomes, there's a possibility that you might pick up a chance finding. So the more times you test for something or look for it, the more opportunity there is to pick something up by chance. And so we're trying to mitigate against that risk. So it's a very conservative decision that we have come to, that there was no effect on hostility. And it was quite a frustrating one for quite a few of our investigators as well. Yeah, someone's just asking about the combination of naltrexone, Vivitrol, and bupropion. Yes, that was mentioned. So that has been found to significantly reduce methamphetamine use in a recent trial. That was by Steve Shoptor's group. And I can't remember the first author on the paper, but yeah. I'm sure we can make that available if people are interested.
Right, before we might wrap up in a minute or so, so if we have any other burning questions, please pop them into the chat. But in the meantime, just join me perhaps in thanking both Ramez and Rebecca for making their time available today. It's such an opportunity to hear about trials that are happening here in Australia and here across our sites as well. So it's so lovely to hear from everyone. And if anyone in the audience, for instance, participated in the trial or was part of it in any nature, thank you to everyone for your contribution as well. And thanks for joining us today.